Hey everyone, and welcome to part 4 of my attempt to beat Kerbal Space Program's hardest career. In the previous episodes, I explored the moons of Kerbin, visited Duna and Drez, and braved the Jewel 5. Now, between me and my goal of planting a flag on every possible body in the game, only Moho, Eve, and Elu remain. However, these final planets will be some of the hardest yet. If I want to get to them and make it back alive, I'll have to face intense heat, freezing cold, crushing atmospheres, and, most critically, my own lack of foresight. Without further ado, I present the final installment of Kerbal Space Program Expert Mode.
The sun is a deadly laser.
The Jewel mission from last episode returned over 4,000 science to Kerbin, which is enough to research every node currently available in the tech tree. However, that's still nowhere near enough for the final two tiers, where each node costs 550 and 1,000 science respectively. Not only am I out of science, but those tiers also require a level 3 R&D building to research, which would cost me 1.5 million funds to upgrade. Suffice to say, I can't afford that right now. But what if there was a way to get new technologies without spending science at all? In my travels around Kerbin, I've discovered a few anomalies, ancient structures that seem to imply the existence of an advanced civilization. While many of these are just Easter eggs with no functional purpose, some can actually unlock new tech nodes when visited. However, you won't find them by looking on the wiki, as they spawn in random locations each save. Before I can go looking for these anomalies, though, I need to fix the communications issues I've been having. Using the newly unlocked Octo 2 probe core and RA2 relay antenna, I'll build the Kerbin orbital relay satellite. However, I won't be launching just one. Instead, I plan to put a trio of satellites in a synchronous orbit to get coverage over all of Kerbin's surface. After circularizing an LKO, I'll raise my apoapsis to 2,863 kilometers, which, according to the KSP wiki, is the altitude of a Kerbin synchronous orbit. Under the Orbit tab in Kerbal Engineer, you can see the craft's orbital period, or how long it takes to complete one orbit. Once at apoapsis, I'll burn prograde until my orbital period is exactly 4 hours, or 2/3 of a Kerbin day. For the finer adjustments, I can right-click on the engine to set its thrust limiter to a lower value. Once my orbit is as precise as I can make it, I'll decouple the first relay probe. To avoid disturbing the orbit of the mothership, I set the decoupler force to 0 in the VAB before launch. Then, using a similar process as before, I'll raise the relay's periapsis until its period is exactly 6 hours, or 1 Kerbin day. Once that's finished, I'll switch back to the mothership and time warp around one full orbit. Because of the different periods, by the time it's back at apoapsis, the first relay is about 60 degrees behind on its orbit. So, I can repeat the same process as before until I have all 3 relays evenly spaced on a synchronous orbit. Let's test it out. As I launch another satellite into orbit, instead of losing connection as the KSC goes under the horizon, you can see it's able to bounce the signal through the relay to maintain control. Now that I don't have to worry about comms, I have a much easier time sending the probe on its way to the moon. However, this one isn't just a relay satellite. Once it's captured into a polar orbit, I can right-click on the probe to access KerbNet, showing a scan of the moon from the probe's point of view. This has some useful features, like showing the biome map and being able to place waypoints, but these aren't the main reasons why I'm doing this. Time warping around to scan the moon from different angles, eventually this question mark appears on the surface. This is an anomaly. There are lots of anomalies on the moon, though so I'll keep scanning until I find one that doesn't match the coordinates of any Easter eggs on the wiki. Then, I'll place a waypoint there, and have the MSL-4 fly over to investigate. As the lander approaches the waypoint's coordinates, I can begin to make out a structure on the moon's surface, one of the so-called green monolith. Touching down nearby, its anomalous properties become apparent. While the probe gets thrown around, the monolith begins to transmit data back to the KSC, unlocking the advanced motors technology. Maybe not the most useful thing right now, but it's 550 science I can spend on something else. There's a green monolith on every celestial body, so I'll launch another probe to search for the Minmus one. It's a bit harder to spot against the green terrain, but I managed to get a visual and steer the MSL-3 towards it. This time, it unlocks high-performance fuel systems. Now, it's time to start planning the next interplanetary mission. Of the remaining planets, I've decided to go to Moho first, as its short orbital period means that transfer windows are frequent and missions don't take long. However, that doesn't mean getting there will be easy. Even though it's much closer to Kerbal than Jool or Elu, its high orbital velocity means that it takes almost as much delta V to get there. But before I can do that, I'll need to figure out what I'm actually going to send to Moho. First, I'll design the Salamander, a lander with capacity for 3 Kerbals, generous fuel for biome hopping, and all the experiments I could fit on board, including, for the first time this playthrough, a scanning arm, which I can use to get science from the breaking ground surface features. To push the lander to Moho and return the crew to Kerbal, I can use the same nuclear transfer stage design from the Jool missions. I'll also throw in a service bay with some extra experiments to use in orbit, as well as a probe core to access KerbNet for anomaly scanning. Because I'm lazy, I'm going to send both the orbiter and lander up in one launch, Apollo style. With a combined mass of over 76 tons, I'll need an even bigger booster to get it all into orbit, but that won't be a problem. With that, Kerbonauts Fredfree, Cathry, and Tansted board the Tiger III. Because Moho's orbit is inclined, I'll be launching into an inclined parking orbit before I depart. The transfer window planner tells me that about 18 degrees should suffice. Once in LKO, I can deploy the fairing and separate the orbiter. Then, with its RCS thrusters, it can dock and extract the lander. But before we leave, I want to recover the booster to get some of my investment back, so I'll use the remaining fuel to deorbit. After a bit of a tense re-entry, it touches down in the grasslands west of the KSC. I'm just now realizing how big the trees on Kerbal are. Back in space, the crew makes some final orbital adjustments before preparing to depart for Moho. Like I did last time, I'll split the escape into 2 parts for higher efficiency. The first burn of about 900 meters per second raises their apoapsis beyond the orbit of the moon. In space high over Kerbal, I can test out the space telescope I brought along for a few extra science points. Being so small and close to the sun, Moho's sphere of influence is tiny, making it an astronomical pain in the ass to get an encounter with. But with enough messing around with maneuver nodes, all things are possible. And another burn at periapsis for about 1300 meters per second puts the Tiger III well on its way to the innermost planet. After just 95 days in space, the ship begins its approach to Moho, and Tansted can go on EVA to begin collecting some preliminary experiments. However, at its current speed of nearly 3 kilometers per second, the Tiger III will go hurtling back into interplanetary space in a little over an hour. In order to get into orbit, I'll need to kill nearly all of that momentum. Once I drain some of the unnecessary liquid fuel tanks, I'll momentarily put the ship on a collision course with the planet, and have Engineer Cathry detach them to save mass. Then, I'll raise my periapsis to around 15 kilometers and prepare for the capture burn. "8 minutes from periapsis and still nearly 900 kilometers above Moho, I put the 3 nuclear engines to maximum throttle. I'm trying to control my pitch here to stop my trajectory from impacting the surface, while still keeping my periapsis low to make use of the Oberth effect. With 2.5 minutes still remaining in the burn, the engines begin to glow red from heat. I've never had to run them at full power for this long before, but hopefully they can hold out for just a little longer. As the apoapsis readout in Kerbal Engineer flips from negative to positive, I'm officially captured in orbit, so I can kill the throttle and let the nukes cool down. Well, as cool as they can get this close to the sun, anyways. As the Tiger III passes its Moho periapsis, I can run the experiments again to reap the rewards of my efforts. Now that I'm in a polar orbit, I can begin scanning for this planet's green monolith. I'll open KerbNet, and... shit. It turns out that KerbNet requires an antenna connection back to Kerbin to work, and having a piloted vessel doesn't count. So, I'll need to launch a probe with enough relay antennas to get a connection from Moho to Kerbin. With 10% antenna power, I'll need quite a few, and having multiple antennas gives diminishing returns, so the math can get complicated. But that's where the Antenna Helper Next mod comes in. Here we can see that, with the level 3 tracking station, it takes 2 of the medium-sized relay dishes to get a signal from Moho. Getting that level 3 tracking station costs nearly all of my savings, though, so I'll do some more contracts to afford the satellite itself. Once funding has been acquired, I can launch the Inner Solar System Relay on a trajectory to Moho. The crew of the Tiger III have to wait a while for it to arrive, but it's worth it to get that in-flight Wi-Fi. Once it's circularized in orbit, I can use the ISSR to begin scanning for anomalies. Then, after some riveting gameplay, I pick up a reading coming from near the North Pole. We have located the monolith. Now that I know where I want to land, the Tiger III can break into a low orbit. Moho rotates extremely slowly, so it takes a lot of time warping to get the landing site to line up with my trajectory. But once it does, Fredfree, Cathry, and Tansted can transfer into the lander cabin. Undocking from the Tiger III, they make their final preparations for the descent. While it's not as bad as Tylo, Moho is still pretty massive for a planet with no atmosphere. Landing here is far from easy, and landing at a specific site is harder still. Firing up its engine, the lander drops into a suborbital trajectory. There's no turning back now. As the salamander approaches the surface, I can start to get the lay of the land below. The terrain is far from ideal, to say the least. At the last minute, I'll pitch up to aim my landing at the bottom of this valley, the flattest place I can find in the immediate area. Touchdown! With that, we have officially put the first Kerbals on Moho. The landing ended up being a bit hard, but thankfully, the legs absorbed most of the impact, protecting the engine. After waiting for the lander to stop sliding, the crew can disembark to begin the surface activities. There's no shortage of science to be done, but that's not the only reason I'm here. So, while the scientist and engineer get to work setting up the experiments, Fredfree puts on his EVA jetpack to go on a little hike. On the side of a hill to the east, this planet's monolith comes into view. As he approaches, it once again begins to send a signal back to Kerbal. This one seems to carry information regarding experimental aerodynamics. I'll mark the site with a flag, and begin to head back towards the salamander. Along the way, Fredfree finds a moho stone, which he can take a sample of for analysis back on Kerbal. As far as the public is concerned, that can be the reason he went out on this excursion. Once he's back on board, it's time to visit some more biomes. The North Pole biome is just a short hop away, so I'll be headed there first. While we're flying over, you might notice the glowing volcanic rifts dotting the terrain below. Like the moho stone, these are surface features from the Breaking Ground DLC, but Kerbals can't pick them up. To get science from these, I mounted a scanning arm on the side of the lander. However, there are a few issues with getting the arm to work, as it needs to have enough room to unfold without hitting anything. I end up having some luck after retracting one of the landing legs, adding another 40 science to my total. Then, Hanstead can go on EVA, trying not to step in the molten lava while she plants the flag. Looking at my remaining Delta V, I should have enough for one more hop before I return to orbit. Now would be a good time to mention that, in addition to locating anomalies, Kerbal can also be used to show a planet's biomes. It looks like there's a stretch of midlands to the southwest, so I can drop a waypoint there and have the salamander make its way over. In addition to doing the usual science, I also have a contract to scan a moho stone, because that's more useful than just bringing one back to Kerbal, apparently. After having Cathry go on EVA to scout out a suitable specimen, I can do another hop with the lander to get within scanning range. Now, having done everything I can on the surface of Moho, it's time to head back for the mothership. As usual when trying to rendezvous with a craft in polar orbit, I'll time warp until the planet's rotation brings me directly under the Tiger III's orbital path. Getting to orbit of Moho is non-trivial, but setting up a maneuver to circularize shows that I should have just enough Delta V to make it. Now, as I coast to apoapsis, an exercise for the viewer. Can you figure out what's wrong with this image? That's right. There are two Delta V counters, and they are not the same. Unfortunately, in the heat of the moment, I didn't notice this until I was handily informed by the red bar of agony and despair. So, I need to think of something fast, or else in a few minutes, Fredfree, Cathry, and Hanstead are going to make a new crater on Moho's surface. One by one, the crew can bail out and jetpack the rest of the way to orbit. Don't worry, Hanstead made sure to grab all the science before jumping ship. The seismic waves from the salamander crashing back into Moho generate some science, so that's a plus. But now we have a new problem. 3 Kerbals, all on slightly different orbits, that need to find their way back to the mothership. EVA controls aren't the best for precisely executing maneuvers, but with 600 meters per second in the jetpack, it's not hard to set up an encounter. After an orbit of Moho, the 3 Kerbonauts approach the Tiger III at last. Now, let's get the hell out of here, shall we? Being in a polar orbit makes getting a Kerbal return tricky. To fix this, I can raise my apoapsis out near the edge of Moho's sphere of influence, where orbital velocity is low, and fix my inclination there. While we're up here, Cathri can detach some of the empty fuel tanks and put them on a collision course with Moho. The burn to get back to Kerbin ends up being a little jank, but the nuclear engines have more than enough Delta V. I made sure to check both readouts this time. The trip home is relatively short, and the 2.5 meter heat shield is more than capable of surviving re-entry from an interplanetary transfer, if you can handle a few extra Gs. Parachuting down in the grasslands, the Moho mission brings home 719 science. That'll be nice when I get around to upgrading R&D. Before sending another interplanetary mission, I have a few contracts to catch up on. The first of those involves the space telescope I unlocked earlier. While I was using it as a science experiment before, it has an additional function. By mounting one on a satellite and launching it into a solar orbit, it can begin to scan space for asteroids. And as luck would have it, one's about to make a close pass of Kerbin. Let's pay a visit, shall we? For the task, I'll dig up a Tabby crew capsule and mount a grabbing unit on the nose. As the name suggests, this will grab onto the asteroid so I can investigate. The asteroid will be flying by on a retrograde orbit, so I'll be launching backwards to match the inclination. Then, Jeb, Bill, and Bob can await its arrival in LKO. But first, there's another Moho transfer window coming up. Since I already set up communications there, I can send some more probes over for more science and contracts. As the Moho research lander and orbiter depart Kerbin, asteroid UQM-297 begins its approach. Using the upper stage of the launcher, I can raise the Tabby's orbit to meet the asteroid at its periapsis, about 2 million meters above the planet. However, coming from a solar orbit, it'll zip by at over 800 meters per second. So I'll detach the stage and use the Tabby's Terrier engine to catch up. Soon enough, its target comes into view. After matching velocity, I can arm the grabber and begin to maneuver in. As the asteroid draws closer, I begin to realize that this is no ordinary space rock. This is a so-called magic boulder, signified by the glowing rifts crossing its surface. Once attached, Bob can go on EVA and take a sample of this strange purple substance. I can't just let this rare specimen fly back off into space, so let's try to capture it into Kerbin orbit. That's a bit easier said than done, though, as pushing 668 tons, the 1300 meters per second of Delta V in the Tabby has decreased to 13. Luckily, that's just enough to break into an elliptical orbit. While the asteroid's orbit isn't exactly stable, a cursory check shows that it won't encounter the moon for at least a year, so Jeb can detach the Tabby to return to the KSC. With that, Kerbin officially has a third moon. I shall call it Dave. After some more contract grinding, the Merlot arrives at Moho. After another 3,000 meter per second capture burn, I can separate the lander probe to descend to the surface. Touching down in the minor craters, it can begin to transmit some additional science back to Kerbin. The orbiter probe has its own set of experiments as well, so I can put it into an inclined orbit to collect some surveys. It's a good thing these contracts are worth way more than the ones I've done for the Moon and Minmus, because I'll be needing a lot of funding to reach my next destination. Eve. Despite being right next door to our homeworld, there's a reason I've been putting it off until now. The purple planet is nearly twice the size of Kerbin, and has 5 times the atmospheric pressure to boot. While landing there is comparatively simple, getting back to orbit from Eve's surface is widely regarded as the most difficult mission in KSP. But first things first, I'll need some communication there if I want to locate the Eve monolith. While Eve is easier to get a signal to than Moho at its closest approach, it's actually more distant at its furthest, so I'll need 4 antennae this time to maintain a consistent connection. But capturing into orbit will be significantly easier, so I won't need to carry as much fuel. As the Eve transfer window comes around, the ISSR-2 is the first to depart. Next, for the most critical part, the Eve ascent vehicle. As I've mentioned previously, the presence of an atmosphere decreases both the thrust and efficiency of most rocket engines. While many engines are optimized for Kerbin's atmosphere, there are really only 3 that are effective at Eve's sea level: the Dart, the Vector, and the Mammoth. So, let's see which of those I have unlocked. Oh, okay then. While I can build a simple 2-stage rocket with the tech I have to get to orbit, I need a way to escape the thickest layers of the atmosphere so that the engine can work. Luckily, I have just the thing. Not only does the Breaking Ground DLC add powerful electric rotors, it also features adjustable propeller blades to use with them. It'll take a lot of electric charge, but with the help of some solar panels, I can make a functional Eve ascender. After testing its viability on Kerbin, it's time to send the Dragon to Eve. Using twin bore engines I snagged from a part testing contract, I'll throw together another SSTO booster and launch it into space. After reaching orbit, I can separate the upper stage, which will put the vehicle on a course to Eve while the booster returns to Kerbin. With access to electric propellers, I can also whip up a small plane to explore Eve with unlimited range. The Dragonfly will land the crew on Eve's surface, explore as many biomes as possible, and rendezvous with the Dragon before the ascent. I also included a probe core, so it can keep exploring Eve after the crew depart. Finally, I'll build the Lion, which will land on Eve's moon Gilly, and carry the crew back home to Kerbin. With one final launch, Jeb, Bill, and Bob can begin their most ambitious mission yet. The ISSR-2 is first to arrive in Eve's orbit, which is a good thing because I'll need its relay antenna for what comes next. To save on fuel, I plan to use Eve's atmosphere to aerobrake the Dragon into orbit. To this end, I added 10-meter inflatable heat shields on either end of its fairing. I'll inflate the one in the rear so that its drag can keep the Dragon flying straight as it enters the atmosphere. With a periapsis of about 60 kilometers, this aerobrake will capture the Dragon into an elliptical orbit of Eve, which will set me up for a landing on the next pass. With a bit of trial and error, I can adjust the orbit of the ISSR-2 to ensure I have coverage during the descent. Before re-entry, I can deploy the fairing and inflate the front heat shield to maximize drag in the upper atmosphere, and, hopefully avoid being incinerated. Passing below 90 kilometers once more, there's not much left to do but watch the fireworks. Once the parachutes deploy, I can detach the heat shields and transfer stage. Not long after, the ISSR passes out of comms range and I lose control, but Eve's atmosphere is more than capable of carrying the craft the rest of the way to the surface. After touching down in the lowlands, I'll time warp until a connection can be re-established. Then, rolling out its solar arrays to keep the batteries charged, the Dragon will slumber until it is needed. 3 days later, the Lion crosses into Eve's sphere of influence, carrying the Dragonfly along with it. In space, high above the planet, I can do all the usual science experiments, and adjust my periapsis for another arrow capture. The entry pushes the heat shield to its limits, but in no time, Jeb, Bill, and Bob are in orbit of Eve. This craft has significantly less drag than the previous one, so it takes a few more passes to break into a low orbit. Then, I can load the crew onto the Dragonfly, and separate the lander to descend to the surface while the Lion boosts back into orbit under remote control. Remote control that it doesn't have because I forgot a probe core. God damn it. Okay, new plan. Bill and Bob board the Dragonfly, while Jeb stays on the Lion to put it back into a stable orbit. Then, once its periapsis is above 90 kilometers, he can go on EVA and leg it to the lander. With some, strategic use of time warp, Jeb can phase through the fairing and hop into the command seat. Now, for real this time, we're ready to land on Eve. Fully deployed, the 10-meter heat shield produces more than enough drag to kill my velocity, as well as thoroughly knock out the crew, but there's another reason I brought a probe core. As the Dragonfly approaches the ground, I can deploy the landing gear and guide it in for a landing in the lowlands. Disembarking, the three Kerbonauts get a moment to take in the atmosphere. Flying with propellers can be a bit complicated, as the optimal angle for the blades will vary with the craft's velocity and the RPM of the motors. To address this, I'm using a Cal controller to bind the deploy angle of the blade to the main throttle. I'll start with a low angle during takeoff, then increase to about 45 degrees as the craft gains speed. For the most stability during flight, I'm using two counter-rotating propellers with 2 blades each to minimize torque. After a short layover in the Midlands to do some science and recharge the batteries, it's time to take back to the skies. At a cruising altitude of around 12,000 meters, the Dragonfly can hit speeds of up to 150 meters per second, being able to fly indefinitely as long as the sun is high enough overhead. Heading north, Jeb and company visit the shallows, then carry onwards into the Explodium Sea. You'll notice that, despite being midday, it's still rather dark out. This is actually a case of my mods making the game harder, as Eve the mod gives Eve the planet a thick global cloud layer that blocks out the sun. But in the interest of video watchability, I decided to edit the config file to reduce the cloud's opacity. That's better. Now's as good a time as any to find that green monolith. In much the same way as I have before, I'll use the ISSR-2 to scan the planet from polar orbit until I get a hit. Turns out, it's not too far from the Dragon, on the exact opposite side of the planet. Well, in that case, I guess I have a lot of flying to do. After 11 days spent touring Eve, we approach the coordinates located by the ISSR-2. The Dragonfly features a fly-by-wire avionics hub, which, in addition to providing extra SAS control, has its own anomaly scanner that I can use to hone in on the monolith. Soon enough, I get a visual, and Jeb can set the craft down nearby. As the crew investigate, it once again transmits some science back to Kerbal. While I haven't been to all the biomes on Eve yet, I think that it's about time to head back to orbit. After one more flight across the crater lake, the Dragonfly is reunited with its larger sibling. There, the crew will board the Dragon and prepare for the Eve ascent. The orbital alignment is important here. As before on Moho, I want to launch when I pass directly under the target craft's trajectory. This time, however, I need to ascend while the sun is high, to maximize power for the propellers. Once I can confirm that all 4 solar panels are working at full efficiency, we are go for launch. As the rotors spin up, the Dragon begins to lift itself off the ground. To maintain stability, I can't ascend too fast, so it ends up taking over 20 minutes to climb through the clouds. After passing over 19 kilometers in altitude, the lift from the propeller blades began to fall off. That means it's time to send it. Firing up the skipper engine, the Dragon orients itself vertically. Then, I can stage off the propellers and landing gear for the boost phase. Even starting from so high up, Eve's gravity and atmosphere will fight me every step of the way. The flight pushes the craft to its absolute limits, but despite his friends being knocked out by the G-forces, and shock heating threatening to melt the cabin around him, Jebediah's piloting skills prevail. Having escaped the worst of the atmosphere, I can separate the upper stage and boost the rest of the way to orbit. After circularizing at 100 kilometers, I can use the final meters per second of Delta V to rendezvous with the Lion. Having triumphed over the Purple Planet and collected nearly 200 experiments, the crew transfer over into their ride back to Kerbal. But they won't be heading home just yet, because it's time to pay a visit to Eve's moon. Gilly is a tiny asteroid that sits in a distant elliptical orbit of Eve. It's most noteworthy for being the smallest celestial body in the game, just 13 kilometers in radius, with surface gravity clocking in at 0.5% of Kerbin's. As you can probably imagine, hitting a target this small is fairly annoying. Matching inclination in low orbit would be expensive, so I'll just plan a burn at the ascending node to raise my apoapsis out to Gilly. From there, I'll mash the Add Orbit button until I can get a workable intercept. With 1200 meters per second of Delta V, the Lion begins to climb out of Eve's gravity well. As the vessel enters Gilly's sphere of influence, Bob can begin collecting the first science from the moon. Gilly is so small that its escape velocity is only about 35 meters per second, so I'll need to cancel out virtually all of my velocity to capture into orbit. But after the endeavor that was Eve, landing here is almost laughably easy. As the Lion touches down in the lowlands, Bob can go on EVA to do the science and raise the flag. What I would really like to find here is Gilly's green monolith. But once again, I'm shot in the foot by the fact that I forgot to put a probe core on this thing. So Jeb, Bill, and Bob will just have to wait until the next EVE transfer window for me to launch a probe. With nothing better to do for the next year or so, I'll take this opportunity to hop between the different biomes, collecting science and completing contracts along the way. Fast forwarding a bit, the Gilly Orbital Research Probe arrives in orbit of Gilly. Because Delta V is in no short supply here, it'll serve as an orbiter and lander all in one. The biome hopping I did while waiting for it to get here has caused the Lion's fuel reserves to run a bit low, but luckily, the Gorp has plenty to spare. With Gilly's barest suggestion of gravity, I can easily grab the craft right off the surface and carry it back to orbit. Once the Lion is refueled, I can send the probe to a polar orbit and begin searching for the anomaly. You'd think that this would be easy, considering how small this moon is, but apparently not. I think it has something to do with the uneven shape of Gilly not mapping properly onto the CurbNet display, but I tried like 3 different times to visit the waypoint I marked from orbit, and found nothing. Whatever, I'll get it later. For now, though, I think it's time to get Jeb and the gang on their way back to Kerbin. After splashing down, the Lion recovers over 2600 science from Eve and Gilly. With that, I can complete the penultimate tier of the tech tree, leaving just 4 nodes to unlock. And checking back in on the Gorp, it finally manages to track down the Gilly monolith, unlocking large probes. But while we're on that topic, where's the Kerbin monolith? None of the geostationary satellites I launched earlier have managed to find it yet, which makes me suspect that it's hiding near one of the poles. And sure enough, launching another probe onto a polar orbit quickly reveals an anomaly on the southern ice shelf. One short hypersonic flight later, the monolith comes into view. I wonder what incredible game-changing technologies this one might hold. As the plane comes to a stop nearby, the monolith reveals its secrets, unlocking nanolathing, which gives us absolutely nothing because nanolathing is an unused tech node that has no parts. Great. So, 3 technologies remain, and where better to find them than the final planet? Eeloo is the furthest body from Kerbal, except when it's not, and my math says that it should have just enough science to complete the tech tree. However, I'll need to visit almost every biome to do so. Let's get right into it. To avoid the mistake I made last time, I'll be launching a dedicated probe to locate the anomaly. I now have access to the Communotron 8888, the most powerful antenna in the game. But with 10% antenna power, maintaining a connection isn't going to be easy. Can you guess how many antennas it takes to reach Kerbin from Eeloo? If you guessed 7, you're wrong. It's 13. I put them all on robotic pistons and hinges for no reason other than because it looks cool, so we are going to watch them deploy. As the Eeloo monolith orbital scanner departs Kerbin, the crew are soon to follow. Aboard the Tiger 4, the 4 veteran Kerbinauts, as well as Murdrin, Cleald, and Milbo, launch to orbit. If this looks familiar, it's because I'm using the same SSTO booster that I did for the Moho mission, as the mass of the orbiter and lander is about the same. Speaking of, let's take a look at that lander, shall we? To efficiently travel across Eeloo's surface, the space program has developed a revolutionary new technology: wheels. The Spider, with capacity for 6 Kerbonauts and all the science experiments that can be used on Elu's surface, features 8 rover wheels, mounted on robotic hinges, to crawl across the planet's terrain. After extracting the lander, the Tiger IV's nuclear transfer stage will launch it onto an intercept course with Elu. Once again, I'm going to perform 2 periapsis kicks to escape Kerbin's sphere of influence. Elu's distance from the Sun, combined with its irregular orbit, makes it challenging to get an encounter with, but it's nothing we haven't seen before. The journey is long, spending over 3 years in solar orbit, but soon enough, the crew gets their first view of the icy little planet. Once inside Elu's gravity well, the first order of business is to start doing science. The second is to consolidate the fuel in the nuclear stage, so Bill can detach some unnecessary tanks. The deceleration burn at Elu isn't nearly as bad as what I had to do at Moho, but it's still nothing to scoff at. 1,300 meters per second of Delta V will capture us into an elliptical orbit, where the Tiger IV will remain while the Emos performs its own insertion. Once it's in a polar orbit, the probe will begin searching for the monolith. While the Tiger IV is at its apoapsis, Bill will go on another EVA to drop the rest of the empty fuel tanks. While the margins are looking a little tight, I think we should have just enough Delta V for the transfer back to Kerbin. With another burn of 200 meters per second, the vessel circularizes at 20 kilometers, where I can get some more science from space near Elu. And now, it's time for the final landing of this playthrough. Val, our backup pilot, will stay behind on the orbiter, while the others transfer into the Spider. Once undocked, it can use its 2 Terrier engines to begin descending to the surface. While designing it, I angled the forward and rear fuel tanks downwards slightly to better align the docking port and thrusters with its center of mass. I didn't put any VTOL engines on this thing, so it lands on its tail, and the reaction wheels can do the rest. With flags and footprints on the final planet, the crew get out on EVA for the photo shoot. Well, there we have it. 15 planets and moons have been explored, and it only took me most of a year. We have places to be and science to do, though, so while the Spider embarks on its Elu road trip, I suppose it's time to reflect on this playthrough and what it took to get here. I had a lot of fun doing this challenge. Working around the limited science required a lot of creative mission planning, especially in the early game. The first moon flyby, with the Kit 6, was probably the single most optimized mission I've done in this series, as there was really no way to unlock any more parts from Kerbin. On normal difficulty, it's pretty easy to finish the entire tech tree without going beyond min-miss. However, this challenge necessitated some interesting low-tech interplanetary craft. The Dres mission, in particular, was bottlenecked by the lack of nuclear engines, and required multiple launches and orbital assembly to work around the weight limit of the Level 2 launch pad. After that, my options did start to open up. While I could have probably gotten more research if I sent missions to alternate biomes on, say, Duna, I didn't want to spend too much time revisiting places I'd already explored. You could probably finish this challenge way more optimally, but I wanted to keep things interesting. This is also why I banned the Science Lab and ISRU refueling, because with those you can easily land on most every planet and complete the tech tree in one launch. If you've played as much KSP as I have, I would definitely recommend giving a 10% science playthrough a shot. 10% funds, though, was much less interesting to play around. Money isn't usually a finite resource in KSP because contracts are always available, but basically none of them are profitable at 10%. Many hours were spent time warping until I rolled something worth doing, and I cut out most of it because it just wasn't interesting. If you're thinking of doing this challenge yourself, I don't think much would be lost if you used 20 to 50% funds. There were a number of other difficulty settings that really didn't end up being all that relevant. Like, I enabled part pressure and G-force limits, but I never called them out because they never actually did anything. Which is a bit of a shame, because I think that could have been fun to design around. In the end, KSP doesn't really have an agreed upon definition of beating the game. It's a sandbox, after all. Many people consider finishing the tech tree to be the victory condition, which is fine, but as I've mentioned before, you can often do that without visiting all or even most of the planets. So that's why I set the goal of planting a flag on every possible body in the game. There were times where I wasn't even sure if I would finish the tech tree by the end of this, but at this rate, it seems like it'll come just in time. Anyways, while I was waxing philosophical, Jeb and the gang visited every biome on Elu. But this challenge isn't over yet, because there's still one planet that I haven't planted a flag on. So, I'll find a natural ramp, and get the spider back on its way to orbit. As we embark on our final journey back to Kerbal, I want to take this time to thank you all for watching. For as much as I've played KSP over the years, all of my careers have tended to fizzle out after a while. More than anything, I started this series as a way to force myself to finish a playthrough for once, and I genuinely don't think I would have gotten this far without all your support. And I don't think I could have ever imagined how quickly my channel would blow up from this. So, thank you. Don't worry, I'm far from done with KSP. I have enough video ideas to keep this channel going for a decade at this rate, and I'm excited to get into the next adventure. As for when that will come out, I have no idea. But, if you want to be there when it happens, you know what to do.